Good morning, everyone. My name is Chen Yijie, a research fellow working at Stockholm Taiwan Center at the Institute for Security and Development Policy. And I'm delighted to moderate this webinar focusing on bridging Nordic dual-use innovation and Taiwan's defense ecosystem. And today's webinar includes two speakers. They will give around 20-25 minutes presentation respectively. And after the presentation, we will proceed with Q&A session. And I would like to start this session with a really short introduction so our speaker can have more time to provide more information and share their insight. So as the security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific continues to evolve and countries across the world are exploring and developing defense products and systems, nowadays the defense products are no longer solely for defense purpose. So many innovations have been dual-use technology, and many of them is actually from the civil application. And geographically, Sweden or the Nordic more broadly are very far from Taiwan. To better connect these places, innovations thus come into spotlight. So through the lens of Nordic and Taiwanese, Taiwan's potential engagement in dual-use innovation and emerging technology, this webinar will explore where Nordic and Taiwanese priorities align, the opportunities and barriers shaping future collaboration, and how dual-use innovation ecosystem can support deeper engagement between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And the first speaker is Bryce Barrows, and he's the former U.S. Senate National Security Advisor and currently a visiting fellow at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research in Taipei. And lately, his research focuses on defense innovation and dual-use technology in Taiwan and applied cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And our second speaker will be Martin Längqvist, and he's a senior lecturer in computer science and AI robotics and cybersecurity center at Örebro University in Sweden. And his research focuses on AI, machine learning, deep learning, and representation learning. And without further ado, we extend a warm welcome to the first speaker, Bryce. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Yijie. Stand by to share. Okay. Good morning, everybody. If you're based in Europe, and good afternoon and evening if you're based in the Indo-Pacific. My name is Bryce Barrows, and I will be leading the first session today for the Bridging Nordic Dual Use Innovation in Taiwan's Defense Innovation Ecosystem webinar in collaboration with AIDO and ISDP. So a little background about me. So I'm currently based at INDSR, the Institute for National Security and Defense Research in Taipei, Taiwan. And I'm doing work on Taiwan's defense policy as well as its innovation work. I've worked at a few different places. I was a defense contractor supporting the US Department of Defense's innovation efforts. I've lived in Taiwan for more than 5 years. And I have also served as a US Senate National Security Advisor, in addition to having worked at several think tanks and a tech startup. And a lot of my research in Taiwan at the moment is focused on learning from small and medium sized democracies and countries for Taiwan in order to find a better way to help Taiwan's own defense innovation ecosystem. But for today, the purpose of the lecture between myself and Martin is to be able to take Nordic technology strengths, right, and try to make them more palatable or understandable for Taiwan's ecosystem strategy. Make sure that we could talk a little bit more about how applied AI, robotics, and sensors are done, and then also talk about different things like that. Okay, so the core thesis, right? So Nordic-Taiwan dual-use collaboration already has practical entry points, which is something we're going to cover a little bit more in this webinar. So there's a few different ways in which there are, these linkages already exist. One, there's been several delegations that come to Taiwan from the various Nordic countries that are trying to talk about the different sort of dual use or defense technologies sort of things that we have covered. And now the key is being able to take those sort of lessons from adjacent technology collaboration. And by that, I mean, not things that are properly focused on defense technology, but dual use technologies, and make it more focused on strategy resilience, and other sort of pathways, right? And those include everything from direct defense / dual use. So that includes like a counter UAS roundtable, as well as interest from drone companies, especially around co-production, co-development. That includes a lot of cooperation on semiconductors, AI infrastructure, quantum, and critical infrastructure protection, R&D and co-funding, and then as well as a lot of startups that are interested in the broader Asia Pacific region, and are interested in sort of civil innovation mechanisms for collaboration. And what's really interesting about this too is that the Indo-Pacific demand signal is increasingly becoming more dual use. At the moment, I'm in Sydney, Australia. I was just here where I am here for a conference I attended last week, talking about many of these same issues, not from a Taiwan perspective, but a lot of what you're going to hear is very similar, right? So talking about the domains that are currently contested, whether that be surface, maritime, air, cyber. Also, how do countries remain more resilient under pressure, which are lessons that Nordic countries are very much aware of. Governments are also trying to think of how to be more affordable and more cost effective with being scalable about systems and not just have like very large prestige systems. So for example, Sweden is a really good example of this, right? With trying to maintain the ability to produce more things domestically for its own security over the last several decades. And then also finding more ways for civil military cooperation and collaboration, given issues around funding and other sort of things, right? But we know that dual use technologies also matter because they're important related to drones, electronic warfare, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, secure comms, and logistics, right? And that goes both in civilian use and military use. And that Taiwan is not isolated, but is an urgent part of what that issue set looks like. And the commercial ecosystem within that can also make it faster for companies or for governments like Taiwan to be able to get some of the capabilities that they need. So one thing that I wanted to take it from this were several questions that were flagged by the Ukrainian ambassador, actually, Vasilia Miroshnichenko, at a conference earlier in June, specifically the Indian Ocean Defense Conference in Perth, Australia. And some of the things that he mentioned, he posed several questions. And I think that's really relevant for the region, right? So can energy bases and ports keep operating when under just duress? Can maritime systems survive autonomous attacks? Can logistics move in contested environments? And can industrial capacity absorb rapid changes? And these are all things to sort of think about from what are lessons coming from Ukraine that are relevant for the Indo-Pacific. And then these are lessons that the Nordics have been paying very close attention to, and in the peacetime context, have been innovating about for a long time. And kind of keeping within that, I decided to focus on 8 capabilities that I think are most relevant. So drones, counter UAS, ISR, maritime awareness, electronic warfare resilience, secure comms, AI and sensor functions, and distributed logistics, right? It's also important to remember that this has a lot of implications for market entry. So ensuring that Nordic countries or Nordic firms, when they come to Taiwan and they're interested in doing business, that they lean into trust, resilience, and co-development, not just products themselves. And
Hello, Bruce. Martin, can you hear Bruce or
I cannot hear Bruce, but I can hear you.
Uh-huh. I think Bruce might have some problem with the connection. Um, oh, he is disconnected. Okay. Mm. We can wait a little bit and see whether he can come in again. My colleagues will come reach out to Bruce and help him. At the moment, Martin, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I can take over.
Thank you so much.
So I will talk about some of the research projects that I have been involved in at Örebro University, and they were not specifically in mind to use for dual use applications, but as AI is a general purpose technology, it can have many different applications. So maybe that's one of the purpose of this webinar, to try to brainstorm what can these technologies be used for. So the first example is the underwater robot. This was a research project in collaboration with Örebro University, Saab, and Murky's brandkår, which is the fire and rescue department local in Örebro. So we had two use cases there. The challenge is when you have an underwater robot, you can end up in murky water or poor visibility conditions. So for example, in the image to the left, you can almost see clearly what's going on. You can see the balloon and the ground floor. But as the engine is operating and it is throwing up dust in the water, you get very poor visibility. It gets very difficult to navigate. So how can we use AI to aid the operator in this poor visibility condition? And what we looked at in this project was if we could use sonar sensors to help the operator. So in the left, you can see the sonar image, and there's an object, I think it's a tire in this case, and you can kind of make it out in the sonar image, but in the RGB camera, it's impossible to see anything. So if we could maybe use the AI to augment the image of the RGB camera in this way, that could help the operator. So it's about aiding the operator and not automating the robot to move and do actions. The hardware that we used to collect the data was this underwater robot. And what they have is a screen where you can see the sonar image in real time, and you can switch between the sonar and the RGB image. And the idea is to augment some AI results from both of these sensors to combine it. What we did is we used different types of objects to see if we can detect them. So we used maybe a toolbox, some pipes, a ball, but we also had the fire and rescue department. So we used a mannequin, and in the winter we made a hole in the ice and put down the mannequin and the robot to collect more human-shaped objects. And here are some examples of data where you can see that in this RGB image, you might see the pipe. In the sonar, you don't see it so clearly. And you also get two versions of, you need to transform the image to a squared image. And here's what it looks like in the software that the sonar is using. Here's another example of a camera and a sonar example. So you can see in the camera, you can see the whole object, but in the sonar, you only see the bottom part of the object. So sometimes the sonar helps more, and sometimes the camera feed helps more. So the challenge here, how can we make a US AI system that utilizes both sensors? So I won't go into the details of the method, but we use two different machine learning models, one trained only on the RGB camera images and one only on the sonar images. and then later fuse the results from both systems to take advantage of the image that gives the best result. So here we see a video example of what it could look like. This is the model trained on the sonar image only, and it accurately detects the object, where it can see the object, and then the same result is augmented on the RGB feed. But what the fire and rescue department wanted to know is not only where is a human or a object. They want to know where is the arm, where is the leg, because they have this robotic arm that can hold onto an arm. So they wanted to know not only where is the human, but where is the arm. And we just replaced the model with a segmentation model instead of an object detection model. So I'm throwing some AI terminology here, but you can see that the shape of the human is more detailed than just a big box. And this was just by replacing the model with another model. So for future directions, we see that we could get much more better models if we got more training data. So for example, if we had a more controlled environment, like a swimming pool, maybe we could get more data of objects. We had ideas of using synthetic data to get more training data, because one of the challenges is you need to have lots of data when you train these models. Here we only used one robot, but I can see we could maybe have a collaboration between multiple robots. And I also see many other scenarios where this can be useful. So in poor visibility conditions, you have, for example, self-driving cars if it's raining. Even if you be a little creative, you also have poor visibility conditions inside the human body. So we had another project with an in vivo camera pill that you swallow, and you get these types of images, which reminds me of a similar type of data. Maybe in hazardous environments like fire and rescue robotics, or even in the mining industry, where a big challenge is how do you deal with dust control. So instead of spraying water, you can have better sensors. The other research area that I wanted to talk about is the satellite imagery. So the first example of a project is a collaboration with Örebro region, Örebro kommun, where they want to calculate an index of how green one area is. So they need to know where are the parks, where are the roads, buildings, and so on. So what we did, this is a typical machine learning problem. You take a drone image or a satellite image, and you classify every pixel in the image. So this is called semantic segmentation, and we define these 5 classes. And from this result, we can then calculate an index, how green the area is. So if it's more vegetation and trees, it gets a higher number. So here are 2 examples. The industrial area gets 0.21, and this greener area is a higher number. And the method was also we used 2 models and then combine the results. And here we see some results. This is the ground truth. So one problem here is you have to have the ground truth or the labels for every image that you train on. So what we had a postdoc who manually sat and labeled every pixel. What he found out, it's very difficult to classify, for example, shadows. So one solution there was to include shadow as a new class. There is also a website you can try this model on the whole city of Örebro. So you select a region and then you get the green area index. But I see in many other applications, this is not just for calculating the greenness in a city. You might want to know other things like what is the traffic, is there areas with higher crime risk, where are the pollution risks areas, fire or flooding risk. You can, as long as you have the ground truth, so if you have an expert that can label the data for you, then you can use exactly the same method. And this reminds me, if you ever played SimCity or City Skylines, you actually have these heat maps. You select land value and crime and so on. So I can see this being used in a real application. Another project with similar ideas, we predict the need for forest clearing. So we have satellite images of forests, and then we want to have a number, how much do you need to clear this forest? The difference between this project is that to get the ground truth, no one can sit and manually label this data. So we used a quite innovative method of tracking the workers when they walk in the forest. And the longer they stay in one area, the more they need to clear that forest, the more they need to cut down trees. So we use that as ground truth to train this model. And here you can see some results that from 2019, the model is saying this area needs more clearing than this. And then next year, this area grows even more and more. And then it was cleared in 2022. And then you can see it's back to the default values. And maybe you can see they missed some area here or where they should go next. So this is not useful only for predicting the need and where to do the clearing, but you can also use it for path planning, that you say that you should take this route and then you can clear the whole area much faster. So for this detailed classification, you can get more applications. For example, you get the path planning for the quickest route. Maybe you have multiple vehicles, you want them all to arrive at the same time. So maybe you want a longer route for one vehicle and so on. What we saw is that we didn't, the ground truth that we used, it wasn't optimal because sometimes the workers turned the machine off and didn't work there. They had a coffee break or something, but the model was trained that it took a longer time there. So if we could use some reasoning to say if the machine is off, then the worker is not working, that would improve the results. And that's kind of the idea we had in the third project that I want to talk about for satellite imagery. Here we combine a neural symbolic integration with machine learning. So neural symbolic integration, it's another field beside machine learning called knowledge representation and reasoning. So you can, for example, reason that a building is a school if it's close to a playground, or if it's close to a helicopter pad, maybe the building is a hospital. So it's not just purely using machine learning as the and given output, it's reason about the result also. So using this, we could generate more classes than just building, try to classify the building. And it can also be used for finding errors in the machine learning model. So for example, what often happens in machine learning, you get these salt and pepper noises where, for example, this is a railroad in the middle of the parking lot, but that's clearly an error. But if we reason about that and saying that railroads are connected and they don't exist near in a parking lot, then we can fix these errors. And we also made a viewer to see the result of the model. This is from Boden, where we classified the whole city. And what we later found out that this type of model is not just nice to see the results in an interactive way, but we could also use it for flood simulation. We could lower and raise the sea level, and then we could see which buildings were at more risk, which roads are not connected anymore. So using this type of reasoning can maybe change the path planning route. Maybe you want to say avoid schools or avoid hospitals, and then the path will be different. Of course, this was a project 10 years ago. Now large language models have arrived, and they are, you can say they have replaced knowledge, representation, and reasoning. It's we can use LLMs instead. And finally, for the final research theme, I want to talk about collaborative robots. This is a project between Saab and the region where we used a drone and a mobile robot and see how they can collaborate. So the scenario for Saab is they have a vessel on the surface and then an underwater robot, and they see different things and they have different sensors. So how can they communicate in a good way? What we did not have access to these vessels, so we used a drone and mobile robot instead. And what you get is you get different views from the robots. For example, the drone can see a more overview, and the mobile robot can see inside buildings and inside cars to see if lights are on, if people are there. And what we did is we collect images from both the drone and the mobile robot to get a large image database. And then we merge it to get a new 3D model instead of images. And in here, you don't have to think that this point here belongs to this point in this image. You work on the 3D model instead. And this can be used to find new buildings, for example, that have been built. This was a parking lot, but then several months later, we got images of a building. So it can be used for environmental change detection. And what we did, we tried to classify walls and roofs. So we didn't have a specific application in mind for this project. But we can see that if you use some kind of shared model, you can easily add more drones and more mobile robotics. You don't just have to use two. You can use a fleet of robots. And the difference here between this project and future applications is the real-time aspect. This was collected with a large image database and then offline created this 3D model. But a big challenge now with dual-use applications is the real-time aspect. And that's a very active research area right now. So this is what has been done with AI. And I would say thank you. And I give the word back to Bryce.
Thank you, Martin, for providing all this example of how AI have been applied in the Nordic region. Bryce, would you like to jump back in?
Yes. And my apologies for cutting out earlier.
No problem.
Go ahead and get back into where I left off. Okay. So where I left off, why Nordic countries should care. And I think Martin actually did a really good job of sort of getting into this too, in the sense from the sort of capabilities of what he's working on. So I think it's also more important to remember that strategic geography between both the Nordic countries and the Baltics is really starting to, it's widening in the sense that both countries or both regions are really starting to see why they both need each other. So Nordic states understand that they need to pay attention to Indo-Pacific security, and that most importantly for them, supply chains are really important. So for example, in the case of Saab, the big company within Sweden, which not only produces the cars that many people like, it's also important because they produce many of Sweden's sort of defense needs, and many of those components and parts are shipped not only from within Sweden itself, but also across the world, including places like Taiwan, right? Also, many of the capability niches that Martin kind of went over talking about autonomy, sensor, secure networks, etc. They also fit what Taiwan needs. So, I think one really good example of that would be when you have a country like Sweden, they do a lot of sort of defense exercises around littoral defense, protecting the many sort of islands that are around Sweden's sort of coastline. You also had that really big exercise for NATO Aurora fairly recently around the island of Gotland. Many of those capabilities needed for littoral defense and being able to sort of like hop around are applicable for certain aspects of a Taiwan contingency. And then another thing to sort of highlight as well within that sort of three-pronged bucket is civilian channels already are going on, as I alluded to, right? So there's already trade happening between the two regions. There's been a lot of emphasis on semiconductors, quantum, artificial intelligence infrastructure, and different sort of ways for R&D. But what's also important to sort of highlight in the context of this webinar is some of the issues or cautions that some of these countries within the Nordics would have towards Taiwan. So, for example, EU/NATO export politics, but also PRC pressure. So you had that instance a few months ago in which you had almost a dozen of European companies, dual-use technology companies, mostly, I think most of them were from Czechia, who were sanctioned by China for engaging and cooperating with Taiwan's defense innovation, dual-use technology ecosystem. And even though it's hard for Europeans to break into selling to Taiwan, there is a lot of opportunities around R&D, trying to validate things locally, and also using the trusted supply chain that Taiwan offers. And feeding into that, don't view Taiwan as a market. It's really a strategic partner and has a lot of manufacturing capability and depth to be a good partner for Nordic companies that are not only trying to source components, but are also trying to iterate on things that they've developed. One anecdote I could provide is that the average cost or the average salary for a engineer doing R&D in Taiwan, with the exception of someone that's working at TSMC or UMC, one of the two big semiconductor companies, is far more affordable and has a better price point for labor than a counterpart that you would find in the Republic of Korea or in Japan. And then sort of taking a step back and looking at the Northern sort of defense innovation ecosystem, it's important to remember that there are a series of different core actors. And I focus only on Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Norway, not on Iceland, just because Iceland's smaller than everyone else. But as you could tell, there's a lot of robust entities that are kind of happening within these different places, right? So for example, Vinnova in Sweden, which does a lot of the innovation work for the Swedish government. The Saab, as I mentioned, Ericsson, which focuses on telecoms, right? Within Finland, VTT is similar in the sense that they do innovation work, as well as in Denmark. You have the same thing with EIFO for funding, Terma, and then also DTU. And then in Norway, Innovation Norway does a lot of good work as well around funding dual use innovation sort of capabilities. And these different countries have different sort of things that would be of use to Taiwan, right? As well as having some already Taiwan facing implications. So for example, Sweden and Taiwan have the Joint Business Council, and they're working very closely on AI infrastructure. Also, this upcoming September, when Semicon, the big semiconductor conference, takes place in Taiwan, Sweden will have its first ever national pavilion. Finland and Taiwan also have a joint business council meeting, and they've been having a quantum technology forum for several iterations, as well as several semiconductor delegations. For Denmark, most recently, you have the company that does counter UAS, by Defense, come visit Taiwan and have a roundtable, which I'll talk about a little bit later about that. And then Norway has also been really interested in semiconductor delegations. So what are some of the different existing pathways, even though they're not all equal, between Nordic countries and Taiwan to sort of collaborate? So direct dual use, direct defense, I put that there, but that might not be as feasible, but direct dual use. The recent roundtable that I mentioned with My Defense is really fascinating because also My Defense, the Danish counter-drone company, also mentioned a desire to want to localize more in Taiwan. There's other European countries or companies from other European countries that are already doing that. I think one really good example is the Portuguese company Tecaver. And Tecaver is known for providing drones that do maritime domain awareness for the Portuguese Navy and the Royal Navy. They are already doing, or they put out a statement saying that they're doing local collaboration and co-production and most likely sourcing, if I had to make an educated guess, for their drones with a company in Taiwan called Apex. And that was announced last year. So it's not just, as well as some of the companies you're seeing from Poland and Czechia as well. Those are the two biggest countries that have collaboration with Taiwan. So the Nordic countries wouldn't be doing their own thing. The only thing that Nordic countries would be risking, or companies, is maybe losing some first mover advantage to other European companies, right? In addition, a lot of the technology that we discussed is very adjacent to dual use, specifically related to the AI infrastructure and high technologies, and also just general innovation, right? There's a lot more startup exchanges, a lot more sort of desire to want to figure out where Taiwan and Nordic countries can sort of fit together. So I'm going to talk about some of the companies or some of the countries individually in this case. So here I want to talk a little bit about Sweden. I just mentioned the Semicon Pavilion briefly, and the Joint Business Council. So I want to highlight something that actually happened last month, where you had the 42nd Taiwan-Sweden Joint Business Council meeting that was specifically focused on AI infrastructure. And why I think that that's more important is because you're starting to see more of these companies really coming to Taiwan. And you also see that even with the Made in Sweden days from last month as well, where you had companies like Ericsson express more interest in Taiwan. And that doesn't have to necessarily do just with the production of smartphones and other things like that, right? I think Finland is actually really interesting because Finland is using forums like Eureka Global Stars to be able to do joint R&D with Taiwan for certain companies, right? 50-50, which is fascinating. The Finns have also put a strong emphasis on quantum technologies and using the Taiwan-Finland Forum to do that. And then also Finland and Sweden, so Business Finland and Business Sweden jointly visited with Innovation Norway earlier this month, Taiwan for a semiconductor visit. And Finland, much like Sweden and other Nordic countries, but specifically Finland and Sweden, show how you can mix civilian R&D for dual use capabilities, and that those mechanisms are important because it's not just interests, there are actual mechanisms for companies to work together. And I think Finland's actually a really useful model for how Nordic countries can continue to engage with Taiwan without trying to overly complicate defense ties. And then Denmark, I want to highlight this closed-door roundtable forum on counter-UAS systems in modern conflict, also in Mandarin, called Shield of Taiwan, or Taiwan Shield. So this was done in collaboration with a few different entities, but specifically the Alliance for Democracies, based in Copenhagen, and a Taiwanese defense technology or national security and tech think tank named DSET. And if you read the public statement, I think it was pretty interesting because it talked about Ukraine lessons from the Middle East, as well as what do some of those like counter UAS deployments look like in a Taiwan environment. And then My Defense, the company that was deeply involved in the closed door roundtable, has expressed through a press release the importance of local production and then technology transfer for Taiwan's drone defense ecosystem. So let's get a little bit into Taiwan and what Taiwan needs, right? And Taiwan's been sort of like signaling this for the last year or so. And I think you're going to be able to see more signals for what Taiwan is looking for in terms of capability later this year as we get into the big defense exercise in August. So Taiwan just had a exercise called the Immediate Readiness exercise, which was supposed to be done in a flash. It was 4 or 5 days last week to be able to ramp up deployment or mobilization in the event of any sort of contingency related to China. And some of the things that you saw from that alluded to here, but also in other things, is a focus on resilience, right? So critical infrastructure is key. In the case of Taiwan, that could be energy. That could even be the TSMC, UMC factories. Unmanned systems continue to be used more and more. Taiwan's been testing out several unmanned systems related to, its defense posture, specifically with the American company Anduril, with the Altius systems. You're also seeing more of an emphasis on ISR that's enabled by AI, and having sensors around the island, not only for air defense, but also for maritime security, which bleeds into what Martin was sort of alluding to earlier, or demonstrating with AI do. Counter UAS goes without saying, very important. Maritime awareness is also key for Taiwan. And there's been several statements in the last couple of weeks, actually, about that for Taiwan security, given some of the exercises you're seeing last week from China on Taiwan's eastern coast. And then secure communications, right? And the key is for Taiwan to be able to take those technologies, quickly validate them, and then integrate them. And not just for defense, right? I mean, I use defense innovation here, but also broader sort of dual use capabilities for civil defense, but also just other sort of mundane things related to agriculture, protecting wildlands and conservation, and other things like that. So just talking about Taiwan's drone ecosystem a little bit, you're seeing a few different things, right? So government demand signals are going up, and even though Taiwan is having its own domestic conversation about how it will fund funding for Taiwan's domestic drone industry at the moment. And there's a couple of different proposals going around for how that's going to happen, given that there was a defense special defense budget pass at the end of last month. It's also important to remember that within that, you tend to get companies that are collaborating with NSIS, so National Chengshan Institute for Science and Technology, alluded there. Industrial capacity or expansion, right? So you're seeing exports rise exponentially. And you're also seeing Czechia and Poland becoming the biggest destinations for drones. And then there's a capability development, right? So wanting to use more drones and signal them, and exercises are happening around Taiwan, as I alluded to earlier. And then that drone capability spectrum creates different sort of openings. Not only selling to Taiwan is a different story, and I think that that's very difficult, but in terms of industrial scaling, so opportunities to co-produce, work together, wanting to learn from Taiwan's own environment, so operational edge, which is very relevant for all the Nordic countries, especially given Taiwan's littoral environment. That dual use sort of base, right? I'll give you one example from here in Australia. I've talked to people who have dual use companies here that are interested in Taiwan. And one of the reasons why they are, not only from a defensive perspective, but also here in Australia, herding sheep with drones is a big thing. And Taiwan uses a lot of agricultural drones, and is making more. So there are ways to sort of partner that together, but then also trying to like partner together or benchmark against other places, right? And Nordic countries fit really well in that, when it comes to Nordic countries being good at tracking supply chains, having a discipline around manufacturing and autonomy, and that could really help the Taiwanese on their own sort of validation. So I just want to include here a very rough overview of Taiwan's sort of like ecosystem around innovation. So in the top left corner, my corner, left corner, Chengshan Institute for Technology, which is the big state-owned defense company in Taiwan. You have the Industrial Technology Research Institute, which spun off semiconductors. You also have the Drone National Team, which is an initiative under the presidential office, spearheaded by Vice President Xiao in Taiwan. Startup Island Taiwan, which does a lot of funding for defense tech startups, as well as Taiwania Capital, which is over here. And then you have other sort of government ministries, right? So MODA is Ministry of Digital Affairs. NSTC is National Science Technology, formerly known as the Ministry of Science and Technology. And then you have the National Development Council, as well as semiconductor base, right? So not just TSMC, UMC, you have companies that are sort of built around that, right? Like Foxconn and other sort of places that bleed into Taiwan's sort of broader ecosystem. And here's a little bit more of a map that sort of matches up where not only capabilities, but also companies or entities are really focused on areas that could be of use to Taiwan, right? So Taiwan's interested in maritime awareness, counter UAS, AI/sensors, secure comms, cyber, space, ISR, resilient manufacturing. For the sake of time, I don't think we need to go over everything, but some things I just want to highlight that are really interesting, I think, in a Nordic case, right? So, for example, space and ISR is big, as Taiwan's trying to think of ways to have more resilient sort of space-based communications and whatnot for themselves. Denmark has a space strategy that's really useful for that, right? Finland has ISI, which is really interesting too. And then Sweden has a decent amount of space tech sort of innovation going on. So here, I'm going to talk a little bit about collaborative pathways I've alluded to. 6 things, keep it short. Co-development, co-production, R&D that's applied. Test beds, by that doesn't necessarily mean defense. That just means a bunch of different applications. Accelerators, a lot of accelerators in Taiwan are looking at ways to support dual use, as I mentioned a couple places earlier, Startup Taiwan, as well as Taiwania Capital, and then field demonstrations. So in the photos here to the right, these are photos taken from Hualien, which is a county in eastern Taiwan. And what's really interesting is for the first time, a drone was used to help in a humanitarian assistance operation and disaster response operation. You had a worker who was in an estuary or a river in Hualien who ended up getting carried out or fled away during some rain. And a drone using sensors similar to what AIDU has was able to find that person. I believe it was Skydio, the American company. And rescuers were able to go ahead and use them. And the way that I would think about sort of like operationalizing this for Nordic companies would be find whatever sort of adjacent tech channel works for you. Focus on building those trusted relationships. There are several different ways to do that from the different companies or different countries, right? Then try to find ways to validate that locally. So figure out where it's applicable in a local sense and where you can actually test it out. And then from there, you could scale up for more cooperation, co-production, et cetera, et cetera. And then overall, the 5 lessons I would impart to Nordic countries when looking to engage with Taiwan or Nordic companies from the Nordics to engaging with Taiwan is relationships are very important, right? Taiwan can be a little bit analog and also really focuses on building relationships in a way that in Mandarin is called guanxi. Those relationships can really matter. You also want to think, number 2, about ecosystems, not just platforms. So who is within the ecosystem that is working on sensors, who are operators, who are trusted supply chain folks, et cetera, et cetera. 3, as I alluded to earlier, adjacent channels are very good for dual use. 4, co-development and getting that validation locally is really key. So making sure that you can find partners that you could co-work with to iterate on things that you have and things that they have. And then also looking at Taiwan as a strategic innovation partner, right? I mean, Taiwan isn't just a market, right? It's a manufacturing and learning ecosystem. And given the AI boom and the amount of tech talent, latent tech talent within Taiwan, there's so much that's growing there related to that. And then that's it for me. Ready for questions. And thank you for listening to myself and Martin.
Thank you, Bryce and Martin, for the very abundant information and the insights about the dual use ecosystem and the examples. And I would like to start addressing the question. And the first one will be, what are the biggest challenges in translating these new application research Martin presented into operational capabilities for dual use technologies?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the challenge is to make it work in real time. So these AI models, they require a lot of compute, a lot of computational power. So one solution is to send the images to the cloud or to some server locally somewhere close by. That's not always the best approach. So the other solution is to maybe make the model smaller. So that's a research problem. How can you get good enough results with smaller models, so not these billion parameter models? But that's the trade-off then, because maybe you have a twice as big model, but you get 1% better accuracy. But that 1% accuracy, when we are talking about important applications, it could mean a lot. So I think the models, one research area is also, it's called edge machine learning to have the models run on the vehicles or drones themselves. I don't think we are quite there yet. These models are way too big for that right now. So more research.
More research.
To add to what Martin was just saying, so at Computex in Taiwan earlier this month, the biggest, I think now it brands itself as an AI conference, but one of the biggest computing conferences in the world, there was a lot of emphasis on AI, edge AI, and trying to build up those things locally. What Martin is talking about, to just kind of browbeat on what he was saying, is correct. Those models are very, very large. However, in Taiwan, you can see that there is a market towards people wanting to solve those issues and localize different sort of programs, software, and whatnot that runs anywhere on the AI spectrum for that sort of localized ways of being deployed and used on a machine itself, instead of focusing on a server or something else that can only be accessed through online means.
Mhm. And the second question is more ethical side. So the audience asks, when it comes to a dual use technology in a broader defense and strategic perspective, are there any ethical and security challenges?
Yeah, and I'm happy to take this, Martin. I think there's a bunch, and they're ones that we haven't really fully thought of. So I can give one example, and this is directly from Ukraine. Um, so I'm also a fellow with a think tank called GlobeSec, which is based in Slovakia and Czechia. And having attended their forum last month in Prague, there was this reoccurring tension that came up between attendees talking about, Ukraine describing using UGVs, so unmanned ground vehicles, to be able to take land, in some cases be autonomous and sort of act as sentries. And there's a lot of heated discussion about the ethics of that, right? So you might hear from a NATO infantry officer or a NATO allied country infantry officer say something like, it doesn't matter if a UGV is sort of doing a sentry watch for an operation and quote unquote is taking that land. It doesn't matter unless there's a physical human there. And that's not to answer your question directly, but it's to show that within the dual use sort of space, these arguments are happening all the time. You're also having discussions about what does dual use mean for other sort of mundane applications, and things that would seem innocuous, right? But also could be used in other sort of nefarious ways. It doesn't mean the technologies themselves are bad. It's just the ethical implication of the people who are using it. And that's literally the definition of dual use technology.
Hmm. Martin, would you like to add on something?
I think a lot of attention is paid on security. That's why cybersecurity is also being merged into research with AI topics. So how do you deal with the data correctly and take care of the results? So it's also ongoing in this cybersecurity research field.
So there are a lot of ongoing research and policy revision on such
Yeah.
dual use technologies.
Mm.
And the next question is towards Bryce. Can you expand more on the concept of validation matter that you touched while explaining how Ukraine war impacted the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, so validation, broadly speaking, and I could give like one example that comes to mind, doesn't directly touch Taiwan, but touches the sort of broader Indo-Pacific Ukraine lessons. Just being able to like figure out when you deploy something, if it's working, is it applicable for the area that you're using it in, et cetera. One really good example that comes to mind, I think it was reported by Naval News, was during operate or exercise Bakalatan, which is the big bilateral U.S.-Philippine exercise that happened in May, but also included 5 other international partners, specifically not just Philippines, France, Canada, Japan, Australia, where I am now, et cetera. Green Berets, for the first time, used Ukrainian USVs to do some operations in northern Luzon. It might not be in northern Luzon, but in the Philippines for the exercise. And that's a validation sort of like concept, right? So knowing that some of the platforms or the Ukrainian USVs, I'm blanking on the name, that they use were effective in Ukraine for the Black Sea, and saying, okay, great, we're going to try this out for a scenario that involves the Philippines, which may or may not allude to a Taiwan contingency, sort of gets into taking those lessons from Ukraine and applying them broader to the Indo-Pacific. And one of the things that Taiwan is having issues with, is finding ways to see how their technology, and what they're iterating on can actually be tested in a battlefield scenario. Some of the reporting that you're seeing on all these drones are going to Czechia and Poland. A lot of that is through intermediaries, most likely going to Ukraine. But there remains a sort of lack of a feedback loop, other than learning the broader lessons of what you're seeing with the Ukraine conflict at the moment.
Mhm. And the next question is, what do you see as the biggest barrier today to deeper Nordic Taiwan collaboration in dual-use technology? I think I have also the same question because I feel like Nordic governments usually are quite hesitant to openly engage with Taiwan. Of course, there are a lot of collaboration under the table, so that's what I'm thinking. Right? Is there any concerns that the Nordic government might be hesitant to deeper this kind of relation?
I'm happy to take a first stab. Although Martin, I think you're well qualified to provide some perspective on this too. Um, a bunch of different reasons, right? One, a desire to not want to get pressure from China is obviously the most obvious. Um, but also, I think there's still a lack of understanding for some of these governments about how to interact with Taiwan, and where are the ways that Taiwan sort of can be useful other than the sort of surface level of the typical sort of talking points you get about Taiwan, like not being a red supply chain, it being like an AI island, that kind of thing, right? And I think some governments in the region are still trying to figure that out. And other governments have different risk profiles, right? Like, there's a lot of cooperation that happens between Taiwan and Czechia on drones, which has been alluded to in the public record. A lot of it's not publicly discussed, but there's a decent amount of that going on. At least for the previous government in Czechia, can't speak for the current one now. That speaks to their own sort of risk profile that you might not get in Stockholm or Helsinki or Copenhagen or Oslo, right? But it doesn't mean that those places don't want to collaborate with Taiwan. They just need to be more measured about it. So I think the fear of PRC sort of backlash, especially when you have a country like Norway, which got sanctioned for around its like salmon industry, over the Nobel Peace Prize almost 2 decades ago. Those concerns are real, but that doesn't mean that there aren't ways to collaborate. So I pass it on to Martin, who's actually doing this day today.
So I would say, from a research perspective, many universities now that do research on AI, they are struggling with, they don't have enough compute to actually try out the top new models, and they don't have the same data sets. And also, we get a lot of more funding for education now instead of research because everyone wants to learn about AI and take courses in AI. So I think from research, I think we can also find collaboration between maybe more startups that can do research in a different way, more applied. Uh, and yeah, doing test beds and these scenarios. I think it's a new, faster way to increase collaboration.
So there's some weight that Taiwan and the Nordic can collaborate with, but we just need to find a way to actually make
Mm,
it happen.
New
Okay.
ways, yeah.
Yeah. The time is approaching 12, and I think I can conclude our webinar with my one last question from myself, because I think Taiwan is really focused on the undersea infrastructure protection these days after several incidents in the past few years. And as Martin mentioned, that the undersea robot AI application in Sweden has been going on for a while. And I'm thinking about from your perspective, um, Is there any possible that Sweden and Taiwan can work on such technology to improve Taiwan's resilience in protecting undersea infrastructure? And if so, in what way?
For example, we can collect data from different environments, and then we can develop models that are invariant to those different environments. So getting data together, trying out different models that we develop independently and then test them out. That could be one way of collaborating and improving, finding new scenarios. For example, what maybe new applications can be brainstormed and discussed.
Would you say this kind of potential collaboration would be better to start from the university level or like pure and the pure research level, or it should be better to start from the applied or the company side?
That's a good question. Because I come from research, I would like it to be research based, but I don't know what the best approach is.
Mm-hmm. Bryce, do you have anything you want to add on? Because I feel like you mentioned the commercial side and could be the incentive for to facilitate more collaboration between Nordic and Taiwan. Do you think starting from the commercial side will be more effective?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of advantages when it comes to starting from a commercial perspective, but that also depends on uh, Sweden specifically. As long as companies aren't getting pressure to not sort of collaborate, or getting complaints from the Chinese government that would sort of prohibit them from being able to um, go ahead and deepen that collaboration. Something I think is really interesting and worth pointing out is at the most recent Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, which is the annual big Indo-Pacific security conference, kind of the Indo-Pacific's equivalent of the Munich Security Conference. You had 17 countries led by Singapore sign this thing called the Guide Framework. So GUIDE standing for Guiding Principles for Underwater Infrastructure Defense Exchanges. And Sweden happens to be one of the founders of it. And interestingly enough, maritime sort of border or maritime neighbor of Taiwan, the Philippines, is also interested or has signed on to it. And the whole purpose of that is trying to figure out, share principles around critical underwater infrastructure, and maybe find ways to better collaborate to share those best practices. So there might be ways for Taiwan to informally be kept abreast of what's going on, either through participants like Sweden or the Philippines or other sort of countries that are included too, not just those two. I think being able to sort of talk between unofficially at the government to government level or through different representative offices about what are some of the threats that Sweden sees as evolving for its own sort of environment and how those might overlay with Taiwan. And you have seen in the last few months an interest within Taiwan to find more sort of solutions to protect its underwater infrastructure, not only using dual use technologies, but also, stiffer law penalties and whatnot for entities that actually do try to break undersea cables and other things, right? Although Taiwan's really constrained, given, that requires actually apprehending individuals that are involved in that, whereas it might be easy for them to go back to places like China or what have you to avoid that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity that's probably won't be discussed publicly, and this is just me making an outlet, like a public sort of uh, very accurate, not accurate, but a very informed guess. But I think there's a lot of opportunities for Taiwan and Sweden to sort of collaborate, and also for Taiwan to pay attention to what's happening in Sweden, and for Sweden to pay attention to what's happening in Taiwan and the broader Indo-Pacific around this topic.
Thank you for your answer. So I think there are a lot of potential area that Taiwan and Nordic can collaborate in future, but we just need to find a way to actually make it happen, and maybe not in a formal way. So now, because the time it's for past 12, and I would like to conclude this webinar today. And special thanks to our two speakers, Bryce and Martin. Thank you for your presentation and all the insight you have shared with all of us today. And I hope to see everyone in the next webinar about Taiwan. Thank you so much.